In this video, I'm going to talk about the differences between bands and chains. They're both great tools to develop your athleticism, but there are also some key differences between the two. So let's get right into it. So first off, I want to talk about why we use bands and chains. And we use it as an implement to put on a barbell to develop more power and force for our athletes using the principle of accommodating resistance. So what is accommodating resistance? It dictates that as we get through the concentric movement, we're adding more load to the implement or to the barbell. So as we come back up from a back squat, for instance, we're developing more force and power if we're keeping that barbell moving at the same speed. We traditionally use bands and chains on exercises that follow an ascending strength curve. What is an ascending strength curve? That's an exercise that as you get further into the movement concentrically, so a bench press or a squat, for instance, as you're pushing off your chest or coming up from the ground, the exercise gets easier and easier. The bands and the chains allow us to flatten out that strength curve. So what is the main benefit of accommodating resistance? It teaches an athlete to accelerate through the total range of the movement. So if we think about a squat or a bench press, for instance, near the end, the terminal range of the movement, there's a deceleration phase, and that leads to a drop in total power output. So if we're accelerating through the bands or the chains, we're gonna decelerate for a less amount of time, therefore adding more force and power through the total movement. Secondly, we can use accommodating resistance to train around injury. So if we're dealing with some low back discomfort with an athlete, we can add chains to the bar and it deloads the bottom portion of a squat where the athlete is more susceptible to injury. And so as the athlete's coming up into that concentric movement, it'll load the bar and give them that stimulus that we're looking for without putting their back in jeopardy. So next, while bands and chains do operate off the same principle of accommodating resistance, there are a few key differences between the two of them. Chains load the barbell in a linear fashion, so we can calculate exactly how much weight is coming off the ground and into the athlete's movement. Bands produce weight in a non-linear fashion. So knowing this, we only use chains for the injury rehabilitation part of an exercise. We don't want bands pulling athletes down with low back pain into a squat. Again, chains deload the bottom of the squat, so it acts as a mechanism to reduce discomfort in an athlete's low back during the bottom of a squat or a deadlift. So chains are a bit more stable throughout the total movement, and for this reason, we use them with newer athletes as well, teaching them about accommodating resistance and how to accelerate through a movement. When we look at chains, they're almost completely deloaded at the bottom of the movement, and at the top of the movement, it's a bit more stable because we're gonna have a few links on the ground. Bands, on the other hand, will have constant tension on the bar at all times. So at the bottom of the range, they're going to be offering you some resistance. And again, the resistance is in a non-linear fashion, progressing through the top of the range. And the main difference that we find when we're loading with chains or bands is that chains offer a reversal of strength. So if we think about that elastic nature of a band when we put it on a bar, as we get near the terminal range of the concentric movement, like let's say in a bench press we're pressing, that band will actively pull that bar back down, increasing the amount of kinetic energy and leading to an increased reversal strength. So this is really important on our speed bench day, for instance, with my athletes. We're teaching them to move this implement as fast as they can and to use that reversal strength to teach that eccentric elastic ability. When you start using bands, always start a bit lighter. Start with an empty bar and a light band. Get used to that elastic nature of the band pulling you back down eccentrically and using your reversal strength to keep the movement nice and fast. So to deload the chains at the bottom of the movement, we're gonna hang the chains from something called a daisy chain, which is just a much smaller chain that attaches to the bar. If we have a taller or shorter athlete, we're gonna have to adjust the length of these chains. And what we're looking for is having about 1/3 or less of the chain on the ground at the top of the movement and almost having the chain completely deloaded at the bottom of the movement. I always tell my athletes add about 10% each side of the total bar weight. So if we have 200 pounds on the bar we're bench pressing, we're gonna have about 20 pounds of chain weight at the top of the movement per side. And we wanna ramp that up to about 25% as they get more comfortable using chains. So while planning the chain weight is quite easy with the athletes, the band isn't as straightforward. We have 5 different bands here and we know approximately how much they weigh and when they're totally stretched. To be safe, we always start our athletes with small bands, teaching them to accelerate through the movement and then working them through the different weighted bands. We want to work them up to about 25% each side of the total bar weight. It's not as straightforward as the chains, so we want to take it a little bit easy in the beginning and slowly ramp them up to that 25%. So the percentage on the bar doesn't have to be perfect, whether it's 15, 18, 20, or 25%. What I'm looking for when we use these implements with our athletes is getting them to increase their intensity, how hard they're trying during the movement and pushing and accelerating through each movement as fast as they can. So while there are similarities between bands and chains, the big takeaway I want you to take from this video is that chains deload the bottom portion of the movement more. So they're more for my newer athletes learning about accommodating resistance, and they're very good for my injury rehabilitation clients and athletes looking to deload a portion of the lift where they're more susceptible to injury. For bands, on the other hand, due to their elastic component, they're very good for my high velocity and jumping athletes, as it teaches them to use that stored elastic energy and rebound through the movement as fast as they can. It's also a bit less straightforward, so I reserve it more for my intermediate and advanced athletes. If you do want to use chains and bands in your workout, start very light in the beginning, get used to the movements, and progress slowly throughout and be safe.